Головне, щоб кабо машина не включила.
Вона включиться обов'язково. Це закон.
Кава всюди, вона має пронизувати все.
Ну, тут є плюси і мінуси, але плюси проживуть. Вони все зламали.
Що зламала?
Все зламали. Ці хлопці у нас постійно все ламають.
Вони ж наче ремонтували. Останні півгодини.
Це так здавалося, це вони ламали.
А, це був хитрий план, так?
Давай.
It's July 30, Ukraine Media Center starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Chepretko, and let me remind you that since quite recently we work in cooperation with Suspilny in a comfortable community space called Urban Space 500. And now we will have the presentation of report about the crimes of Russian Federation, 5,340 victims of violent abductions. We have the Center for Civil Liberties group who presented the facts to the International Criminal Court. They say that Russia resorts to the systemic practice, mostly persecuting people with pro-Ukrainian position who were serving in Ukrainian government services, police, or the armed forces. Joining us today are Hanna Ovdiienko, a lawyer, co-author of the report, Oleksandra Romantsova, executive director for the Center for Civil Liberties, and joining us online is Mykola Komarovskyi, a lawyer of the Kharkiv Human Rights Group, co-author of the report. So, Mr. Oleksandr, first of all, I think it's worth explaining what is violent abductions and why is it necessary for the most people to know about what it is, and as well as many influential organizations. In the international law, there is a number of definitions of abductions which may result from different events. And for example, if people disappear as a result of, say, avalanche or earthquake, they disappear. But the violent abductions is a whole different thing, because the reason for the people to disappear, or the cause of people to disappear, were the activities of other people, and those people are somehow affiliated or directly represent the government, or we have to prove that if someone gets abducted by Titushkas during the times of Yanukovych, there is no direct relation to the state, but they can be associated with the government regime. And this is why the violent abductions in the territories of so-called LDPR can be called violent abductions, because there is hierarchy, organization, and there are people who may cause such violent abductions. Ukraine recognized and ratified. It's one of the latest conventions of ours that we've ratified in 2015. We've ratified the convention of this specific category, the violent abductions, because first of all, the beginning of the war in 2014 resulted in an avalanche of such events, of such violent abductions. It means that people are imprisoned or illegally detained, or that the people may die. We don't know it for sure, and it's the first status after which investigation should be taking place, and then we understand, we hope that people are alive and they are being illegally held captives. So then we undertake such investigation. In case of the state, there is an obligation, in case of violent abductions, to provide information about such individuals. even if we have some indirect evidences that people may have died, that's not enough. Us as a society, as the relatives of this person, we are entitled to know what kind of violent abduction it was and what is the fate of this or that individual who was abducted. This is why we understand that given such a huge area of contact of Ukrainians and people who resided in Ukraine with the occupational forces, it's a terrible environment for a large number of violent abductions. And then in future we see that people are being illegally detained without any convictions, accusations, in the cellars in occupied territories, in Belarus, in Russian Federation. So as a phenomena, it's extremely spread in Ukraine, and it accounts for a large percentage of war crimes and crimes against humanity, maybe even an element of genocide that all result from Russian aggression. Thank you very much for your explanation, Ms. Hanna. So let's proceed directly to the study. What were the results? Who are targeted by the Russian Federation to be abducted? And can we describe some generalized portrait of a victim of such violent abductions? So first of all, first thing we've seen is that Russia was systemically committing the violent abductions under the same scenarios. So we can say that there is a certain scheme how it was done, despite the region, oblast, units of Russian Federations that were stationed there. Those were the crimes that were committed under one single scheme. So first of all, when Russia entered our territories, they already had the lists of the people who further on were subject to violent abductions. Those were the civil activists, government officials, public servants, journalists, volunteers, members of political parties, civil rights persons, and other people who were able to actively resist Russian propaganda machine and who could physically resist. So it's about the military who didn't switch side, or the police, or the state bodyguard service representatives who didn't switch sides. So again, this campaign was previously prepared, and those lists were put together by someone, unfortunately. After the first wave, after those people were deported from those territories, arrested, or we don't even know what happened to them, probably some of them were even killed, then there was another wave when everybody whom collaborationists were pointing at may have fallen victims to violent abductions. Close friends, relatives who may have become such victims only because they were pointed at by the people who decided to cooperate with Russia and to work for them. I'm aware of the cases when only people of specific professions were becoming victims of violent abductions, like photographers. Photographer is, like a person who is not really related to any, for example, human rights activities or civil activity, but just for being a photographer, who could make photos, and the neighbors just came up with the idea that they could have photographed the Russian material, and they reported such person to Russian occupational forces. And another category were the people who didn't want to switch to Russian language. They were just saying, like, Ukrainian language is my native, so I'm not speaking Russian anyway, or who were expressing any oppositional thoughts. So basically it's the portrait of a pro-Ukrainian person. However, there were a lot of random individuals who may have fallen victims of such violent abductions, who were pointed at by the collaborationists due to some ownership of business, for example. Sometimes such people were lost for years, and we never had any information about what happened to them. And in maybe in 1% of cases, Russian military were saying what happened to person after an arrest at the Black Post. But in the majority of the cases, the Russian military or the Russian authorities, so-called authorities installed by Russia, were provided no information, and we got no responses to any requests whatsoever or any inquiries. Some relatives don't know what happened to their loved ones until this moment, and even after the occupation of Kiev region, there is a lot of cases of violent abductions because people were not found among either dead or alive whose bodies were identified after the deoccupation. Thank you, Ms. Anna. Unfortunately, the violent abductions are still going on, not only in the newly occupied territories, but also in the territories occupied since 2014. So, Mr. Mykola, can you please explain us what should the relatives of the victims of violent abductions do, where to go, which doors to knock on? Well, basically to provide aid to the victims of violent abductions. Kharkiv Human Rights Group launched a hotline to support such individuals. We're talking here about both civilians and the military who disappeared under special circumstances in the territories that may have ended up under occupation. It's 0800 24 2022 is the date of the full-scale invasion. Our operators of that hotline, they gather minimum information necessary to start the work, and then you're getting in touch with the lawyers of the Kharkiv Human Rights Group who start the investigation to identify the whereabouts of the person who was violently abducted. We work in a number of areas. First of all, we look for the information in the open sources, the OSINT reserves, so to say. We check relevant channels in social networks, so all of the channels where the information may be published about the whereabouts of a person who was abducted or disappeared. Also, we talk to the families of the abducted persons. They tell us the information about those persons who still stay at the occupied territories or who stay in the penitentiary facilities of Russian Federation. Also, we check whether such a person who addresses us was addressing other government offices or agencies. If there were no such inquiries, we submit them. If it was submitted before, we check the status. We actually address the coordination headquarters and other agencies who are responsible of this work. Then we submit inquiries to the relevant agencies of Russian Federation and to the so-called authorities established in such entities as DPR, LPR, and occupied Crimea. And as soon as everything was done in the national level, as soon as all of the inquiries were submitted in the occupied territories, then we addressed to the United Nations Task Force on Violent Abductions. Unfortunately, we can't give you 100% guarantee that we are able to find a person who is missing, but at least 30% of the people we were able to find. So basically, we can boast some results. Thank you very much, Mr. Mykola. So this report has become a foundation for the submission to the ICC. So, Ms. Hanna, can you please tell us what were the details that you were able to gather for those organizations, and what are the regions where such violent abductions were observed on the highest level? Well, so first of all, the text of this survey, of this report is published in our website, in the website of the Kharkiv Human Rights Group. It can be downloaded. So this report was submitted to the International Criminal Court a half a year ago, and the report to the Task Force on Violent Abductions was submitted just recently. So those documents contain, first of all, the cases of specific violent abductions we've gathered the cases that we were able to provide the most evidence to describe the scenarios of those violent abductions and to provide as much evidence as possible. So those are not only the cases who are supported by the information about the effect of people going missing, but also about the witnesses. There are sometimes even the videos from the surveillance cameras which were still working. Also, there is some statistics. We continue gathering the information and we get more figures, but back then we had information about a little bit more than 3,000 cases of violent abductions, and now, as it was already said, we have information about more than 5,000 such cases, and our report was only about the civilians, so we're talking about the number of civilians who went missing as a result of activities of Russia. We're not even touching upon the topic of the servicemen, which are way more numerous. Talking about the regions where the most of the people were abducted, it's difficult to say, because for some regions we don't have final statistics because they're still occupied in full, or the major part of the region may be occupied. I mean Donetsk, Luhansk regions. In those regions the details will be updated and will be modified significantly after we conquer back our territories. So talking about the biggest numbers, in our case it was the biggest number was documented in the Kharkiv region. Basically the reason for that was because almost all of the Kharkiv region was deoccupied. We've got access to those territories and respectively to the information about the people. Secondly, since a lot of lawyers work in Kharkiv, they were able to visit the occupied territories to gather such information, and of course this information was submitted to International Criminal Court. And talking about the next step, it should be taken by the Office of the Prosecutor of International Criminal Court, who, after investigation of this case, will become interested in direct contacts with our victims who provided consent for such contacts, and respectively we hope that it will result in those people providing evidences against Russian Federation in International Criminal Court. I would like to emphasize the crime of abduction of Ukrainian children. Mr. Mykola, talking about the children, do they fall under the category of violent abductions, or from the point of view of international criminal law they fall under a different category? Well, in reality it's a little bit different situation, but in the majority of cases, not in the majority, but in some cases, children fall victims to the violent abductions, which is not really described extensively. Well, I don't want to analyze the wrong stated. I just need to emphasize a couple of things to explain what is the difference. So, deportation of children, which is widely discussed, is about their deportation from Ukraine to Russian Federation, is signing of Russian citizenship to them, handing them over to the families and having them integrated into Russian society. So this is basically the fact of violent deportation. ICC qualified it under Article 8 as a war crime, and based on that they've issued the warrants for arrest of Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, the Commissioner of Children's Rights of Russian Federation. So those activities can also be classified as crime against humanity or crime of genocide. Basically, the Kharkiv Human Rights Group insists on classifying it as crime of genocide. We also submitted our case to ICC requesting reclassifying it from Article 8 to Article 6 to crime of genocide. So getting back to violent abductions, it's committed in the context of the crime against humanity components of which were already described. An easy example is, for example, when Russian officials could come to occupied territories, view a 17-year-old youth, for example, as suspicious. They suspect them of support of Ukrainian armed forces. They detain them, send them to jail. Their family can't get in touch with them, and for example, that 17-year-old youth wouldn't be able to get any legal aid from any attorneys or any other people who are engaged in human rights activities in the occupied territories. And giving you a little bit of statistics, in a report to ICC, there are 4% of such situations related to children. In Kherson region, it was 5 children. In Kharkiv, 69 children, and 2 children in Zaporizhia region. In the special register for the people gone missing that we maintain together with our hotline, there are 42 persons missing. And in the database of T4P coalition, there are 99 episodes, but it's the preliminary classification that should be verified. I mean, every episode should be verified to identify whether it was effect of violent abduction. Thank you, Mr. Mykola. So basically, the submissions were made to the United Nations, to ICC. What else can we do to hold those accountable who are guilty of those crimes? So the ICC works with our Office of Prosecutors General, and our Office of Prosecutors General has a right to formulate the case in coordination with their human rights groups and to submit it to ICC to open the case, to identify, to investigate who is the top-level government official of Russian Federation whose orders resulted in such violent abductions. So we have to remember that International Criminal Court, they hunt the big fish. This is why it's one of the ways how we can have one of the Putin's adherents held accountable. And we have to remember that Ukraine, by ratifying the Rome Statute, makes sure that they can hold accountable not only the direct executioners of the crime, not only who tortured, who were detaining, but also to hold accountable those who were commanding the units, the people who were administrating the prisons, were the people who were violently abducted, were held dead. And then we have to remember that every submission to the United Nations is another drop for the historic justice and political decisions to support Ukraine, to refuse the position of Russian Federation, to better understanding what is negotiations process, and can we during this negotiation process talk about freezing of the front line or amnesty, understanding those thousands and tens of thousands of victims that the control of Russian Federation over any Ukrainian territory results in, because if we mention violent abductions since the beginning of the war, since 2014, they included minors, for example, who were drawing graffiti in Donetsk. So we have to realize that violent abductions is something that accompanies Russian army everywhere at all times, that accompanies the operations of Russian law enforcement or intelligence. And we have to remember that just as long as Ukraine doesn't set all of its people free, including those staying illegally captive in the Russian Federation, until that moment there will be no peace in Ukraine. So for what I understand, the submission is one of those that were received by ICC. So basically, I mean, either organizations document this story too, they make their submissions to ICC, and the number of victims is way above 5,340. Is it correct that I understand that all those cases should be led as a foundation of one single case by ICC that may have come up with one joint warrant for all of the perpetrators? So this is basically what we aspire. If I'm not mistaken, you can see 6 submissions in our library. Also, the Coalition Ukraine 5AM is actively dealing with this issue, plus the information that was submitted to our prosecutor's office, who cooperates with the International Prosecutor's Office or ICC Prosecutor's Office, is submitted by a lot of different human rights organizations. But again, ICC, they focus on top officials, the decision makers. However, there are mechanisms that are such as universal jurisdiction when Ukrainian cases are being submitted by NGO in other countries. For example, recently the Clooney Foundation made a submission in Austria. So there is this mechanism of universal jurisdiction. Also, there is a mechanism to address the ICC, the International Court on Human Rights, which is in the system of the European Commission, which will bring us closer to the mechanism of reimbursement of reparations. And also there is a mechanism of United Nations Court of Justice, which deals with the issues of genocide, and probably it's not the last case. And MFA will see the perspective in other submissions regarding such processes. So Ukraine has to use all of the available civilized legal international mechanisms, because on top of the final ruling that would be hopefully useful for Ukraine, there is the necessity to support the necessity of political support of Ukraine, because when you submit a case which is put together under the standards of the justice that is trusted, for example, if we are able to submit a case in the United States where there is a huge trust to justice system, it gives us opportunity to fight Russian propaganda that tries to overcome our reality with the virtual reality, because our reality is made of such submissions, is supported from such submissions of the lawyers of Kharkiv Human Rights Group, by the way, the oldest human rights organization in Ukraine that was active since the times of USSR. So it all gives us opportunity to repel this terrible propaganda storm. Dear journalists, in case you have any questions to our journalists, please proceed. And if we don't have any questions from the floor, so let me remind you, we had a presentation of a report about the crimes of Russian Federation, 5,340 victims of violent abductions. So we will continue at 1300, and we will have the presentation of a report called Some Challenges Related to the Reintegration of the Occupied Territories and Memorialization. Stay tuned.